by a bent line, by a straight line, by a crooked line. The Crooked Path, a podcast for modern cunning folk with Peter Paddon. Hello and welcome to The Crooked Path. My name is Peter Paddon, and tonight we are going to take a look at the Vampires and Werewolves. But first, the news. You're probably tired of hearing about this by now, but tough, I'm going to tell you again. And at least once more time after this, so tough. New Orleans, November. My beloved wife Linda and I are going to be heading there November 7th and staying till the 12th. And over that particular weekend there are two spectacular events that you won't want to miss if you happen to be in the neighbourhood. The first of these is the Folk Magic Festival with Orion Foxwood, Mama Star Casas, Cindy Todo, Susan Diamond, and a plethora of wonderful people with them. And you can find out more by, if you do a Google search on Folk Magic Festival, you can get all the gory details and the workshops they're doing. And they're going to be, let me see, November 8th through 11th, so that's basically Saturday, Sunday and Monday, culminating in a great feast at an incredible restaurant. So if you're going to be in the area and you fancy learning some conjure, it's an ideal opportunity. Oh yes, Bloody Mary is also one of the people teaching workshops there. So you can find out about Marie Laveau, you can find out about all different aspects of conjure, and you can hang out with some really cool people. And we're going to be there too. Linda's attending some of the classes and I'm going for the food, because why else would I go to New Orleans? That same weekend, on the Saturday, it is, let me just make sure I get the name right because it's a new name for this year, the Magical Media Conference, also known as the Pagan Podkin Supermoot, will be taking place. And on Saturday afternoon you can find all of us weird pagan podcasters hanging out at Azuli's Voodoo store in the French Quarter, and we're doing a meet and greet there, so you can go and chat to your favourite pagan podcaster whilst picking up some dolls to stick pins in, because what else would you do in a... well, no, I can't do that with a straight face, but it's an opportunity to meet podcasters, maybe get some goodies, and maybe just have a good time. And besides, you'll be in New Orleans, which is a win all round anyway. And Linda and I will be hanging out for a few more days after that before returning to Los Angeles, so we can do some sightseeing and make the most of our little mini vacation. So that's New Orleans. As you are well aware, I have a publishing company, Pendrake Publishing, that publishes books written by me and a bunch of other people, including Robert Artisan. Where did Paul come from? I watched the movie Paul the other night, and I think it's stuck in my brain somewhere, being taken over by aliens. Robin Artisan is one of our authors, Veronica Kummer, and a whole bunch of other people, including Mama Star Casas. And what you may not be so aware of is that, as Pendrake is specifically for traditional witchcraft and folk magic non-fiction and fiction with a pagan theme, whether it be fantasy or whatever, sometimes I come across manuscripts that I would really dearly love to publish, but they don't fit in the Pendrake family. And so I've started a new imprint called Excaliban, which is a play on Excalibur, obviously. Hopefully, obviously. If not, you need to check your pulse. But it literally means from the ground, or out of the ground. And so it's just a funky name we decided to use. And we're just on the verge of releasing our very first book on that imprint. It's a crime novel, crime mystery novel called Bird of Paradise by G.J. Patterson. And it is a wonderful story, and it's the impetus for me starting the imprint, quite frankly. I had a couple of books that had submitted to me, which I thought, it's really nice, but it's not really a Pendrake book. And then I got this one, and I thought, I don't care what it takes, I have to publish it. so I started the new imprint. So you can thank G.J. Paddon for this strange expansion into the non-pagan world. The book is a really cool story. Obviously I think it's terrific, or I wouldn't have gone to all this effort. It's also been put up, it's up for a couple of LGBT awards, because some of the characters in it are homosexual, and it is set in the 70s with rock stars and kidnappings and all kinds of funky 1970s going on. So if you like that sort of thing, and I certainly do, I heartily recommend you give it a read. It actually, I'll tell you a secret, it's officially out on October 31st, but if you do a search on it on Amazon, you'll find it's already available. They've got their wires crossed and made it available early, so you can get it now. Haha. It's a good book. A decent sized book as well, nice for a long flight, or sitting on the beach, or sitting in the cabana while your pool boy does whatever pool boys do. But anyway, it's a damn good read, so I heartily recommend it. And just to complete the saga, I finally got my Sandblaster today. It was delivered late, which is typical in the scheme of the way things went. I mean, I've been waiting 5-6 weeks for it. It was supposed to be delivered last week, but wires got crossed, and so it ended up being delivered this week. It was supposed to be delivered on Friday. It got delivered to the distributor, whose depot is just down the road from my house, on Thursday, but nobody mentioned that you had to make an appointment to get it delivered to a residence, and so finally I got it delivered today, and of course it came late, so I haven't had time to actually put it together and use it yet, so I'm kind of but it is at least in my garage, and tomorrow I will put it together and play with it, and if it blows up, so will I. Because I've been waiting so long for this. But anyway, that's enough. So you can expect some funky new glass styles to be gracing my Facebook page and websites in the not too distant future. So there you have it. Let's take a look at some lore. And it is entirely possible that I've gone completely crazy, especially with tonight's subject. Vampires and Werewolves. It may not be something you would normally expect me to talk about, because I'm not, generally speaking, a big proponent of the otherkin world. And so you might be thinking, what the hell, why the hell is he talking about vampires and werewolves? Well, part of the reason is because, in case you hadn't noticed, it is October, and we're coming up on Halloween / Samhain / excuse to wear slutty outfits, aka my favourite time of year. And of course vampires and werewolves are very much a relevant part of that whole process. But there's also a lot of interesting stuff about vampires and werewolves that you might not be aware of, and so I thought I would share it, because I'm generous and giving and more than a little crazy. But then you already knew that, didn't you? So what are we talking about when we talk about otherkin? Otherkin is an interesting subject because it's changed a lot over the years. Otherkin is normally described as a community of people who see themselves as partially or entirely non-human. They contend that they are in fact in spirit, if not in body, not human. And this covers a plethora of mythical beasties, and also the category that is known in the wider world as furries. Although otherkin generally don't like being lumped in with furries, because when you hear the word furry, you think about the people wearing mascot outfits who show up at conventions and what have you. And otherkin tend to be a little more spiritually oriented, but believe me, a lot of them wear exactly the same costumes. The main difference being is that otherkin believe that they will, although they may have been born in a human form, that they actually house the spirit of a non-human entity, whether it's a werewolf, a vampire, a fairy, an elf, a squirrel, a daffodil. I haven't come across any plant otherkin so far, but that's not to say there aren't any. So I just wanted to have a quick look at some of the categories of otherkin that may have some relevance to traditional witchcraft. So the first one I want to look at is the fairy folk. And I don't want you to confuse this with the people who are practitioners of Anderson fairy tradition or are followers of Orion Foxwood's fairy seership program, because they are humans that work with fairy. But rather I am speaking about the fae, people who consider themselves to be fairy spirit in a human body, or just fairies who happen to look human. There's a lot of interesting stuff about the fae, and there's a lot of old traditions. They're probably the oldest version of otherkin in the modern sense that you might find, because there is right back into Celtic times there is the tradition of the changeling, where the fairy folk were said to steal a human baby and replace one of their own babies in the crib to be raised by the human family. And this I think is very interesting, because I know in my early days of witchcraft we were taught about people who were considered fae, and there's two different categories: the people who are naturally gifted, born with psychic faculties open, is one way of describing it. And the other type of fae was people who were considered to have been born with a non-human spirit inhabiting them. And this is actually a concept that was very popular in theosophy, although it goes back much further. I mean, you'll find accounts of it in ancient Egypt and probably most cultures in the world. Basic idea to use the theosophical approach, because it's the one I'm most familiar with. I bought some very strange books when I was young, so yeah, bear with me. But in theosophy, the idea is at the moment of conception, an energy vortex is sent, for want of a better description, upwards into the astral realms to attract the spirit or soul that will become the person that has just been conceived. And according to the old theory, if you're drunk or high or otherwise out of sorts at that particular moment, sometimes it goes off course. And the idea is, if you can imagine, and remember this is all metaphorical, it's not describing any literal function, but if this vortex of energy goes up to collect a spirit, under normal circumstances it goes straight up and gathers a human spirit that is waiting to be incarnate upon the earth. However, if you're drunk, apparently your vortex is a little off key as well, and it can go off in a different direction and enter one of the non-human realms and grab an elemental spirit or a fey spirit or something else. And so what you end up with is this spirit that is not meant to be human inhabiting a human body. And frequently they seem to be elemental, so they tend to be very, very strongly focused on one particular one of the classical elements: earth, air, fire, water. And it's an interesting phenomenon, and I've actually encountered a few people who fit the description perfectly. I mean, I'm not going to go so far as to say that they definitely were elementals in human form, but they very much matched the description. I mean, if the psychic police had put out an APB for an elemental, these people would have been pulled in for questioning, let's put it that way. One particular guy I remember who was very puckish, very pannish, and was very obviously, by the descriptions given, an earth elemental who had been born in human form. And you might think, oh, that's really cool, and actually it isn't, because 99 times out of 100 these elemental beings who get pulled into human form don't have a very good life, because they are not equipped to deal with human life. Their emotions, their attitudes, everything about them is keyed to their element, so they're going to react in a very earthy way. which means that they aren't going to deal with things that fall outside of their elemental sphere of influence, which usually makes for a reasonably unhappy life, because there's a lot of parts of everyday human life that don't work. They don't tend to be good in relationships because they're not well-rounded individuals from a human perspective, because they're very focused in sort of they've got like a segment of the human experience that they're very, very focused and very proficient at, but the rest of it is a mystery to them, and they can't grasp things that are outside of their element. And so you tend to find that their moral compass is very skewed, not because they're immoral, more because they're amoral. A lot of elemental folk tend to be very promiscuous. Not that that's necessarily a bad thing. I mean, you know, in my teens I liked people who were promiscuous. I had no problems with them whatsoever. But it does mean that their behaviour can sometimes be seen as inappropriate by people, especially if they don't respect the boundaries of relationships, and elementals tend not to understand relationships, and therefore they don't respect the boundaries. So you're very likely to be standing there with your wife, having her being severely hit upon by an elemental who, when he doesn't get anywhere with her, may turn his attention to you. Once again, not a big problem in the big scheme of things, but some people find that to be a little uncomfortable, and elementals can often be recognised by the fading black eye from a couple of nights previously when this particular scenario played out. And so faithfulness, and they're not dishonest, but their concept of honesty is not human. And so there can be all kinds of problems interacting with other people because of their limited understanding of the whole process. Plus, they energetically, obviously, they tend to be very potent in that element, which means that they draw things to them that are of that element. A fire elemental is going to have a suspicious number of fires starting around them, for example. An air elemental is going to have problems with weather, with wind, with all kinds of stuff. Unbalanced air element tends to manifest in things falling over and breaking a lot. I guess it's the whole Mercury retrograde syndrome personified. So an air elemental born in the human body is basically Mercury retrograde on legs. So don't let them log in on your computer, whatever you do. and likewise water, lots of emotional issues, and earth is going to be stability issues, and it's going to be difficulty with things changing. And so what generally happens is people who in the old days would have been classified as being elemental, and maybe would have been encouraged to go into a monastery or some other kind of sequestered life where they can avoid the things that cause them problems, tend to end up committing suicide or ending up in psychiatric care, which is very unfortunate. But it's an interesting phenomenon, and when you meet one, it really makes you think. Of course, there are also non-corporeal fairies, the entities that fairy seers and Anderson fairy initiates work with are every bit as potent and present as our gods and ancestors are. And we've been known occasionally to work with fairy as well, the people in my tradition. We don't tend to make a habit of it because it's not our specialty, to be perfectly honest, but every now and then it doesn't hurt to put a shot glass of whiskey down for the little people, especially if stuff keeps going missing. The whiskey tends to get them too drunk to hide it, apparently, or something like that. Then there is the vampires. Everybody is familiar with Count Dracula. Well, hopefully. Unless you haven't watched a movie or a television program in the last 20 years, you've probably heard of Dracula, and vampires are something you're reasonably familiar with. Of course, we will, refrain from mentioning the sparkly ones, because they're not really vampires. They're just annoying. There's a lot of things going on in the world concerning vampires. Aside from the otherkin vampires, who can be emotional / energetic vampires, or sanguinarian vampires, which means they actually drink blood. There is a whole range of psychic phenomena that are known as vampirism as well. Somebody could be a vampire and not know it, an energy vampire that is. We all know people who, whenever we're around them, we feel tired, we feel drained. They seem to suck the life and energy out of a room. And frequently this is done unconsciously, but sometimes there are people who do it on purpose. But whether it's conscious or unconscious, it's really bloody annoying. And probably more techniques in psychic self-defense are designed to prevent you being drained by an energy vampire than any other thing, because it's the most common psychic attack that you're likely to encounter. Although, as I said, frequently the people who are responsible for it aren't aware of what they're doing. It's a sort of innate nature of them to do that, and that can be a real pain in the butt, sometimes literally. Amongst the other kin, there are both kinds of vampire, the energy kind and the blood kind. I've yet to encounter somebody whose fangs grow, but I have encountered people who have bought custom prosthetic teeth, and also people who've had surgically altered teeth, so they have permanent fangs that have been provided by a dentist for a great sum of money. And generally speaking, if you come across a sanguinarian vampire, they are going to have very strict rules about where and how and who they feed on, because obviously in this day and age you can't just sip any old person's blood. You want to check that they don't have infections and diseases and various other problems, and that they're not an undercover cop trying to arrest you in the process as well. And so they tend to be very up on getting tested for HIV and other sexually transmitted diseases, and also hepatitis, and there's various other nasty things that can happen to your blood through no fault of your own. And so you tend to get an almost monogamous relationship between a vampire and his cow. I don't know what the proper term is, but they have one or two people that they bleed and drink from, and it's usually done with some sort of sterile instrument rather than with the teeth. Teeth are not actually a very efficient way of tapping into somebody's bloodstream, unless you just rip their jugular out, in which case it's very efficient, but you can only do it the once, for obvious reasons. But for me, the really interesting thing about vampires is the historical connection between vampires and witches. And this is one of the things that you may or may not have come across, but I've done a lot of studying on it and find it absolutely fascinating, that there is a very definite connection between witchcraft and vampires, to the point that groups of both are known as covens in this day and age. I don't know whether that got started in the video game or role-playing game side of things, or whether it came from something older. But it certainly is an interesting thing that nowadays both are referred to as covens when they're in a group. But the thing that I find really interesting is that a lot of the old legends about vampires talks about ways you can escape from a vampire. For example, throwing a bag of seeds on the ground at their feet, because they have to stop and count the seeds. And basically, when you see all these strange things, like they always have to be invited in, they always have to stop and count things. If you untie their laces, they have to stop and tie them up. Although who's going to untie a vampire's laces when they're trying to escape? I don't know, but apparently if you do, they have to stop and retie them. Basically, vampires are OCD, which is kind of amusing, especially when you think of the Count from Sesame Street. Always has to stop and count things. And the really interesting thing is that when you look at traditional witches, old school witches, they tend to be OCD as well. And this time I'm not talking about stories, I'm talking about in real life. And there is a definite connection between vampires and witches linguistically as well. I don't know how widespread the belief is, but there are a number of traditional witchcraft traditions that believe the vampire legend and its connection with blood is tied up with the witch blood, and the word that gave us the modern word vampire, the old I don't know which language it was, but the original word was apparently wampir or uampir, and it actually originally meant overseer. And the basic idea was, and this is going back to Celtic times, and it's just one version of the story. If you can imagine what I'm telling you from the Celtic stories had correlatory versions in the other cultures of the time, the Germanic tribes, the northern tribes, and so on and so forth. Basically, the idea was way back then. We're talking about before Christianity came around, so we're talking definitely BC here, and that's not British Columbia. The concept of self-awareness was a lot less prevalent. Self-awareness, individualization was much less pronounced in the average person. Humans were much more of a hive mentality. The serf system, feudal system of ancient Europe was geared towards a group mentality, a group mind, and people didn't tend to think outside the box. They didn't step outside of the box. I mean, until comparatively recently in Britain, until about 100 years ago, there were a majority of people never left the borders of the village that they lived in. And you know, village is not a large area. You're talking about maybe a 5-mile radius from their house, and they didn't go beyond that in their entire life. And so there was very much a consensus between people. People tended to work in a herd mentality, if you like, if you will. And now this is really convenient when you're in a farming community. A lot of farming involves sitting and watching. You watch the crops grow. You watch the animals get fat. I mean, you know, you go and do the chores, but the chores are repetitive and very not mind-centered. And so being less self-aware is a blessing in many ways. And it really helps to make sure that the daily chores get done. You're actually perfectly happy to do the same routine day in and day out because that makes sense to your psyche. However, it falls down a bit when there's something unusual happens. If you have a hurricane pass through or a flood, you don't know what to do because you can't think outside the box if you don't have self-awareness. And so what happened in Celtic times was the nobles you had the idea of the wandering court, or the procession of the court, which was started back then and actually came into fairy lore in the form of the Seelie and Unseelie courts and the procession of the courts that we know from myth and legend. But in Celtic times, the court of the High King would actually process throughout the land as well, and there would be lesser courts that would process. I mean, the lord of a domain, the lord of a realm, a county or a minor kingdom, would process within their kingdom in the same way. And the basic idea was that amongst the nobility were those who had this extra something in their blood, in their DNA, that gave them self-awareness. Self-awareness was not rare, but it did exist. And the people who had it would be members of the court and would travel around solving problems for the villagers who couldn't think outside the box for themselves. And this is where the term wampir or overseer came from. And they would obviously be given gifts and payment in various forms. And the tradition of the blood, part of it was because it was the sacred blood. It was the sacred king cycle, the witch blood concept. It was seen as they had the blood, they had the sight, they had whatever you wanted to call it. And so the idea of blood and the term vampire kind of got taken literally at some point and said, oh, they took blood in payment. But there's more to it than that, because there's also the whole witch blood and the sacred king cycle, and the dragon kings, the Merovingian kings, who were descendants of the late great JC and Mary Magdalene, if you're into that sort of thing. There's also various other concepts to do with blood that all got combined and ended up becoming the legends that we now think of as vampires. But it's all very closely tied in, and as I said, most of the people I know have a natural affinity for traditional witchcraft of the kind that I and my coven do. Tend to have some degree of OCD. I mean, we were sitting and chatting one night, and we suddenly realised we all had the same thing. We all had to count certain things. You couldn't close your front door when leaving the house unless you had your keys in your hand, because if you didn't have them in your hand, you had to go back in and check whether you'd left them behind. You always had to, when wiping a counter surface, you always had to wipe it so many times. You always had to do things in certain numbers. And we found this was a very common theme amongst people who practice traditional witchcraft. So that OCD thing is definitely there. So I think, there's something to this whole vampire-witch connection. Whether it makes us grow the long teeth on the full moon, not so sure about that, but I certainly like the idea of the OCD being a marker for witchcraft. Then there's the werewolves. I'll never forget watching my very first Wolfman movie with my dad when I was a kid, and of course the focus in horror stories has always been on the lycanthropy, the transformation into a wolf, which is sometimes described as a scientific or pseudoscientific thing with this illness that causes you to act like a wolf. And then there is the otherkin take on it, which is that you were born with a wolf spirit, and they are probably the most common type of otherkin that you'll find out there. A lot of people who believe themselves to be werewolves, and they find a pack and join the pack, and there's an alpha wolf, and they do some. They're very interesting, especially considering 90% of the activity takes place online. And there isn't really the same connection with witchcraft, but it is an interesting phenomenon, and a lot of people nowadays are finding in the otherkin community a way of expressing their magical selves, and the two often go hand in hand. My personal theory is that as part of the awakening of the witch blood in someone who is meant to be on the path of traditional witchcraft, there is what we call a beast or dragon aspect of the persona, which is awakened. And what I think happens is people who don't have the benefit of training or knowledge or understanding find this happening, and they look around them, and the thing that fits the description of what they're experiencing is otherkin werewolves, and so they tend to relate to them because of that. And so maybe there is a connection. People who have a propensity for being werewolves in the otherkin community, maybe people who are awakening to witchcraft, but they found werewolves first. I don't know. It's feasible, and I'm not going to sort of make any assumptions or judgments on it. But I've known a couple of people in all of these different walks of life, and some of them can be a major pain in the butt, but then that's ironically human nature. But there's some very cool people who are doing some very cool things as well. So don't dismiss it. When you come across one of these people, have a think about how you might have reacted if you didn't know where you were going. when things started happening for you, if they have. And you know, always keep an open mind and a closed wallet. But you know, I just think it's a fascinating subject, and it is something very relevant to this time of year as well. So hopefully it was just as interesting for you. So let's go and have a look at some praxis, shall we? So it seems only fair, if we talk about the lore of werewolves and vampires, that for our practice we should talk about shape-shifting. Now, shape-shifting is a very interesting subject. It's something that has been very closely connected with witchcraft for millennia. One of the most common tales of witches being captured is where a witch had transformed herself into a hare to spy on or cause mischief to others in the village, and the villagers retaliated by hunting the hare, and they would wound the hare, and the next day the witch would show up with a wound matching the one that had been inflicted upon the hare, and that's how they knew it was her, and so they would throw her in the pond or whatever and execute her. And it's you know, a fairly common story that you seem to get repeated over and over again. And there are other classical shape-shifting tales that tend to be connected with otherworldly or fey people. My favourite one is the Selkies of Irish myth. The Selkies are the seal people. They transform into seals, and when they transform into humans they basically wriggle out of their seal skin, and they have to conceal the seal skin. That's quite a mouthful to say. And then they transform back into seals by putting the seal skins back on. And you can actually work quite some mischief if you're able to get hold of one of their seal skins and prevent them from transforming. They will do pretty much anything to get it back, because it's very important to their life. So you can be an absolute bastard and steal their skin and get money with menaces in exchange for returning it, which is yay humanity. But there's a whole lot of shape-shifting things associated with witchcraft. Obviously in Welsh witchcraft you have the tale of Ceridwen and Grion Bach, where there's shape-shifting going on all over the place, which is pretty darn cool. But in Anglo-Saxon witchcraft there was a very interesting practice of shape-shifting, where the Anglo-Saxon witch would carry with them a piece of animal hide, and it would be skin from the animal that they wished to change into, and it would actually be called a fetch. Fetch has several meanings in witchcraft, and this is one of the oldest. It's the skin of the animal you wish to shapeshift. If you like, it's a token of the animal to give you a connection to the animal in order to enable you to shapeshift. And I don't actually know of any modern traditions that still practice that particular way, although it is still talked about. And I think it's really shifted, rather than carrying an actual piece of skin or even a whole skin in the way the Selkies did. In more modern times the witchcraft traditions have tended to switch over to guising, where they use masks for the same purpose. And I think some of that is pragmatic, and some of it is because the ritual, ceremonial element of working with masks is a lot easier to teach and a lot easier to pass on. And so I think that's why it's gone that way. And just a reminder, while we're on the subject, that my next book, which should hopefully be coming out in February of next year, is a book on practical guising. It's making and using ritual masks for magical purposes. So where are we? Blip, 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 blip. My favourite form of shape-shifting, actually, I tend to use a term that I borrow from Terry Pratchett's Discworld novels. The witches of Discworld use a technique that they call borrowing, where they basically go into trance and they borrow literally the body of an animal. They take control of the animal and basically control it and use it to go and find out things and gather information and see what's going on further away than they can walk, and various things like that. And it's literally going into a trance state and letting your consciousness enter that of an animal. And it is actually a very old and very respected witchcraft tradition, or technique rather, and one that I'm working on restoring to my particular tradition, and who knows, there may be a book about that in the future as well. Maybe after the Geising book is out, I may do a book on borrowing, and it won't be, can you lend me $5? Because that's easy. And really sad. But anyway, that's it for this week. That's all I wanted to do. Just wanted to talk about the Wolves and the Toothy guys, and get you into the Halloween spirit, ready for the ghosties and ghoulies and creepies and crawlies and things that go bump in the night. So see you next week, when we will have another exciting seasonal theme. Take care now.
By a bent line, by a straight line, by a crooked line. The Crooked Path, a podcast for modern cunning folk with Peter Paddon.